Hello and welcome back to Plant Pod. I'm Robert Romej. We got Brian Hook and Makenna Ayres. How are you guys doing?
Doing well.
So good.
Good. We're just coming off of recording the first episode, so this is the second one. I ask you how you're doing because it'll be a whole week when people hear the next one. So, it's a whole new episode. So we are continuing in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Yes. So we went through verses 5 through 9, and today we are going to read 10 through 15. So, Makenna, will you read that for us?
Sure. All right. According to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation, and someone else is building upon it. Let each one take care how he builds upon it. For no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. And now if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. If the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire.
Thank you, Makenna. Mm-hmm. So last week, on the last episode, we talked mostly about planting and just what that is and people having different roles in the planting, whether it's watering or planting. So what would you, if last week we talked about planting, Makenna or Brian, what would this passage really be talking about, you think?
Yeah, as much as we say the church is not a building, which it's not, this is about actual buildings. like a physical building is the kind of metaphor that Paul uses in this section, and what will become of that building depending on what the foundation that has been laid is.
Yeah. And we've seen, I mean, if you read through your word, like, I think those materials, gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, those things are mentioned in other passages, right?
Yeah.
So as we're talking about building, like, what's the first thing that comes to mind as you read through this passage?
Well, I think, one thing is the foundation. I think with every building, the foundation is the most important. And we talked a little bit about that during our church portion of the Kingdom Framework. And we talked about the importance of Jesus being the cornerstone and what are you building upon. And, we see in different passages the importance of laying a good foundation. Well, the reality is this, and it takes the pressure off of us. As church planners, the foundation has already been laid. So we think sometimes we're laying a foundation when in reality, it's already been done, and we're simply making sure that we're aligning our work with the cornerstone, which is Christ. So,
can I poke at that? Can I ask you a question about it?
You can. You can poke at it. You can make fun of it.
I'm not going to make fun of it.
You can critique it. Go ahead.
So Paul here says, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation. But he does go on to say, in verse 11, for no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. So we know that Jesus Christ is the foundation, but Paul's the one laying it. So there's no pressure, you said, in laying the foundation, but yet he still had a part in it.
He is. He's participating with God. And I think that's really what we're doing as church planners. We're simply joining in what God's already doing. So that's what Paul's doing. He's not laying a different foundation. He's participating with a foundation that's already been laid. Paul's coming after the initial disciples, really. The disciples were with Jesus. They saw him crucified. Here's Paul coming along, and he's laying upon that. And he's really setting into motion an example for others to follow, which says, this is how you do it. The foundation has been laid. Lay on that foundation. So there's a foundational relational dynamic to it, right? So we come along and we plant our church, but the foundation of Christ and him crucified is the foundation. So what do? We preach Christ crucified, which lays on that foundation. But if I'm preaching something else, like a foreign gospel, I'm doing something other than opening up the word and preaching Christ crucified. I'm actually laying another foundation upon Christ's foundation in word, but not really, because it's a contrary gospel. And so, unfortunately, we see people do that. They they use Christ in name. They say it's a Christian church, yet they don't preach the gospel. They don't open up the word. They don't use the word. It's figurative. Paul says that's not what you do. You preach the word. So I think that's the first thing that stands out to me.
What I'm picturing, which this would totally go
Great question, though, and I'm glad you poked at it.
Good. What I'm picturing, I know that this wouldn't work in construction, but like, you have your foundation, which you pour the concrete, or whatever you're making out of it, let's say concrete. So if Christ is the foundation, when you planted a church, it would be that he would make that foundation, that concrete. So you wouldn't go and do it something else. I was originally going to say maybe it's the blueprint, but it's more than that. Like he's also the actual physical concrete, but it's almost as if you could have that exact same concrete and you get to choose where it goes to some degree, but God is also telling you where to put it. Because like Paul says, he calls himself a skilled master builder, which is a little funny, right? He's like, I'm like a skilled master builder. So he had some part to play in like where this is going, which God is probably telling him, like, I want a church in Corinth in this case, right?
Yeah.
But
I think he's preaching the gospel. He's using the word. He's establishing elders. There's deacons that he's establishing. He's teaching them how to make disciples. He's teaching them the foundational elements of what it means to plant a church. And we're still seeing that 2,000 years ago today. We're seeing people come in, preach the gospel, preach the word, lay on that foundation that Christ has already really laid, participating with that, and doing nothing out of the contrary, making elders, establishing the foundations, taking of the Lord's Supper, baptizing new believers, discipling them, and I'm going to do it again, and keep doing it again, and keep doing it again. And he doesn't really say anything other than I'm a wise builder, which means means he's getting that word from God. So he's not creating his own wisdom, it's wisdom from above. So he's aligning himself based upon what we've seen in 1 Corinthians 1 and 2. There's the wisdom of men and there's the wisdom of God. And he's saying, I'm a wise builder. I'm just doing what God told me to do. Laying upon his foundation.
Yeah, that's where some analogies kind of fall short because it's hard to picture physical foundation because it's not even duplicated. It is Jesus each time. It's the same exact foundation. We have multiple buildings in different places. So obviously the analogy falls flat a little bit, but just picturing that. And what you were getting at before I started poking at it is there are churches who have laid a different foundation other than Jesus, but have Jesus on the placard outside, so to speak.
I think Jesus gives that warning in the Sermon on the Mount, right? I mean, he talks about a different type of foundation that
at the end of it. I think I have my bookmarked in there.
In Matthew, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, which is just so interesting because Jesus has just given this epic sermon to thousands of people and has just hammered in so many deep theological truths, and yet he ends by basically saying, like, there are two outcomes to this. Like, you either hear this and you build on my foundation and you'll be able to withstand the wind and the rain, or you build it on anything else. It doesn't matter what it is, and it'll be faulty. And when the wind and the rain comes, it's destroyed. And so Paul has very similar imagery in talking to the believers at Corinth of saying, everyone is going to be tested through fire. So in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, it's not that the person with the strong foundation on the rock, it's not that they didn't have wind and the rain. The wind and the rain still came, but they were able to withstand it because their foundation was solid. And so in the same way, it's interesting that regardless of what your foundation is, the wind and the rain come, you're tested by fire, but that determines what the outcome will be, is what your foundation is. And so when Paul's talking about it, he's saying, like, the wood, the hay, the straw, that's going to get burned up, and that's not going to be fun. Yes, you might still be saved, but it's going to be real unfortunate on this side of heaven if that's your foundation, as opposed to, precious stones, gold, silver. those, when they're tested by fire, it actually reveals impurities, and the impurities are taken out, and it's stronger on the other side of that fire. This is talked about again in 1 Peter, the first chapter, I believe, like verses 6, 7, 8. It says, like, the tested genuineness of our faith is through fire. It's more precious than gold. And I just think that's a really cool idea, because I think sometimes it's easy to get into the mindset that, oh, once we have it right, once we have our foundation, then everything will be good, right? It's like, well, that sounds good, but that's not the case. We are all going to go through these different trials, but depending on what our foundation was laid on, how thoughtful we were in laying that foundation, will determine what we will look like on the other side of those trials. We're either completely destroyed, there's nothing left, or we're even stronger than we were before the trials.
Yeah, no, it's a good reminder that all the trials or everyone's going to experience those.
Mm-hmm.
I think as a church planner, it's a necessity. Like, to make sure that you are humble enough to know that, as we talked about last week, just coming into it with humility. This is where this organic thing happens here. We're looking at building, and we're, in our minds, we're thinking of when we maybe purchased our first home, or you built a foundation, or maybe had a poor foundation. So it's easy to go to the physical, but the dynamic of it is so organic. Like, yeah, we're building, but in each one of our lives, the question is your foundation being laid? And for many of us, we have to go really deep with God and allow Him to really dig down deep in our lives to get rid of some things before we plant, in our own lives.
Fire, yeah.
And I think, I remember in Dallas, there was this high rise that was going up, and it took 2 years for them to even lay the foundation. And it's kind of like that in our lives. I mean, what were they doing? They were digging down deep. They were going deep so that the building could go high. And the deeper they went, the higher the building could go. And for us, we just want our church to just grow. And we want our lives to just have so much fruit and so much visible, using the building illustration, to be like a high rise. Who wants a one story? Let's build this thing out, like spiritually, right? But to see that happen, we've got to go down deep, and God's got to go down deep with us. And so that stuff that's happening in our lives, many times church planting, I've heard this from church planners through the years, especially if the church plant doesn't necessarily in their minds work or succeed. Sometimes that church planting is about you. Sometimes it's about working some things out in your life. And the good thing about that is no church plant I've seen is a failure, because even if it may not get off the ground, or it may only last a couple of years, some things were really done in your life and in the life of your wife, that if you can open your eyes and say, you know what, it really wasn't about the going up higher. It was about going down deep. And God wants us to go down deep with Him and to do some things in our lives. And that's foundational work. So when we talk about foundational work, sometimes it's deeper than the surface of what we see. And sometimes it takes years to figure out what God was doing in our lives,
Well, and in this context, in this passage, because it sounds like Jesus is the foundation in both of the analogies that He's using, and He's saying you can build on it using either gold, silver, precious stones, or you could use wood, hay, straw. And He even says, like, if the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved. So it's like your foundation's still Jesus, but what you've built on top of it is not going to last, or it's going to last and be purified to what you said, Makenna. So do you think that the wood, the hay, the straw, is that things that are more for glorifying themselves? Is that kind of what you were getting at, Brian? Is all of a sudden in this picture, that's what that would be, is, yes, Jesus is the foundation, but now I'm starting to point it back to either myself or other things?
Yeah, I think wood, hay, and straw would be considered bad.
Right.
And I would say gold, silver, and precious stones would be considered good, better, and best. Like, there's some things that we are about that aren't necessarily gold. They may be silver. Like, sometimes we have to say no to some things to get the best of what God's doing. And I think those other things are bad. And those things are typically, pride, arrogance, and things that we're doing, building with, that are really, they're not going to last. And sometimes it's even motives. Sometimes it's the motivation behind what we do. Sometimes it's doctrinal things. Like you can actually doctrinally be correct, but you don't do it with love.
Yeah.
And God says, ain't going to last.
Yeah,
That's straw.
so
And you got the doctrine, and you're like, no, I got doctrine. And, Jesus was very hard on people that had doctrine without love. And so sometimes it's the motive. And he comes back in 1 Corinthians 13 and says, you can prophesy in my name, right? But, you didn't love. You can heal, but you didn't love. You can speak the tongues of men and of angels, but you didn't love. You can give, but you didn't love. So he would consider even doing things that are good with the wrong motivation or the wrong intent and say that's bad. And that's not going to last, Yeah, it's right, but it's wrong because you did it with the wrong heart.
Okay. It's
very organic. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think so, because I don't think I really picked up on this when we were talking through this yesterday, but he's kind of, what he is saying, I think, is the foundation is good either way, but what you end up building on it isn't. And, it's a little bit different than, it's very similar to what Jesus said in the end of his Sermon on the Mount. But also different in the sense that, like, that one, the foundation itself was wrong.
Right, yeah.
This one is the foundation's right, but if you build well, you actually receive some sort of reward. If you don't build well, you'll probably won't, or you'll receive a different reward. I don't know what those are, but that's, you can actually build something poorly, I guess, on the foundation of Jesus.
Yeah, I think that some things will last and some things won't, and you will be called to account of what that is. And I think sometimes we do see people, especially as church planters, we see planters, all of a sudden their plant just takes off, and you see so many things, but you kind of see some things. Maybe you don't say it. Maybe sometimes you do say it, and you're like, I think they're building with the wrong material. You don't say material, but you say things like, it seems like it's all about them. It seems like it's all about the show. It seems like it's all about the lights, camera, action. It seems like it's all about...
That makes sense. No, that does make sense.
All I see is that person on their Instagram.
Right.
All I don't see a lot of discipling going on.
Yeah.
It seems like it's all about the church service. And, not
It's
naming
probably
things, but you look at it and you're like, what's going on there? And you don't want to judge, because ultimately, here's the thing, and this is important for all of us, God will judge that in the end.
Yeah.
And God is going to take care of that. Don't worry about that.
I mean, it literally says that, right?
Yeah.
As through fire.
Absolutely.
As you're talking about it, I don't know if this is taking it too far in here, but if you were to build a building with gold, silver, and precious stones, it does take longer. It's probably easier to build things with wood, hay, and straw. It's just not going to last. So.
Well, we know how to do that here in Arizona.
Yeah.
It's typically wood, mud, and chicken wire. That's what we build our homes, and then we sell it for $1 million.
Yeah.
That's what we do. So we're not trying to cut down those of us that build homes here in Arizona, but at the end of the day, gold, silver, and precious stones is a lot better.
Yeah.
And obviously it's not talking about the physical.
Well,
but
even when I'm building something, I'm willing to tackle a project if it's out of wood. If you tell me to build something out of brick, I probably will take a second guess. It sounds like a feat that I don't know what I'm doing. So that would take me a lot longer to figure that one out. But no, that is good. What do you think about the reward part of this? Do you want to talk about that at all? At least touch on it? It says if...
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing we can touch upon is the fact that there's some things that are going to be burned up, the things that will not be able to endure the fire, and that obviously is a judgment thing. That's a purification thing. That's what will remain will be the only thing that will remain is that which is God initiated and God orchestrated. Yeah. And God empowered. So in other words, nothing we build here on earth with our physical hands and its physical, none of that will remain. None of it. And even some of the spiritual things, supposedly spiritual things we do, some of those things will be burned up as well. Even though we may think they remain, sometimes those things won't. The only thing that will remain is the things that are done in God. Jesus tells us that. He says, apart from me, you can do nothing. In other words, apart from my power and my initiation and my life and my orchestrating this, nothing will remain. But if it's in him, it all remains. So
Right.
that will, and you are rewarded as such. So you can lead a ton of people to Christ and see them come down the altar. It's possible to have 500,000 people come to know Christ, and you get no rewards for that because you did it in your own power and you did it in your own initiation. Are they not saved? Sure, you preach the word of God. They can get saved with the word of God, but you may not have any reward for that because you did it in your own power. You did it in your own desires, your own pride and arrogance. You're not going to get one bit of that for eternity.
I feel like we, just talking through church planning and just being a Jesus follower, it always goes back to listening to the head, listening to Jesus, listening to what, and obeying. Because if you do something out of your own accord, God may use it, to your point. But if you didn't listen to him first and hear, like, is this where you want me to go? Is this what you want me to do? And it becomes your own thing, then you're not really listening to him. So it always feels like, oh, that's too simple. But it is, right? Like,
it's good news and bad news. I mean, really, it's good news. It's bad news in that it may be burned up. But it's good news if you did it for the right motives. And then you could just say, hey, God, whatever's of you, I'm happy with.
right.
You know?
Whatever happens with this.
But you know what's great? Any Jesus follower is going to get some reward. I mean, you're going to do something. You know, you may live 30 years and do one thing with the pure motives, right thing. But you know what? There's a reward there. Nothing wrong with that. You get in and you're going to escape. Barely.
Yeah.
But you're in.
Things will be burned up. Your
I
foundation
do think
will
there'll be
there.
a moment, though, for all of us when we will answer for what we did and did not do in his name. And I do think there's some tears on that day.
Yeah.
I do think that there'll be some shame on that day. And Jesus tells us he'll wipe every tear from our eye. Where's those tears come from? I think it comes from the reality that, wow, this really was going to play out this way. This really was about building for him and him alone. It really was for his glory and not my own. And some of those things will be, you know, but I don't think the tears for me is going to necessarily be what I did wrong. I think it's going to be more like, wow, I wish I could have done more. I wish I would have not wasted a day or a week or a month or a year or decades doing something for my own glory rather than God's. And I think there'll be some tears on that day.
I think that's such an interesting concept too. To your point, Rob, like, the foundation will still be there if everything isn't. I was thinking, so growing up in Southern California, I'm used to earthquakes. And so I was just thinking about how buildings are built to accommodate earthquakes in California and thinking about, the buildings that are, they stand firm during an earthquake, that are standing straight up and not moving. Those are actually the ones that crumble during an earthquake. It's the ones that aren't moving. But oddly enough, the buildings that sway side to side during an earthquake, those ones make it through the earthquake. And so I'm just thinking about, you could be that building that looks firmly rooted and doesn't move at all when the earthquake comes. And yet, you get to Judgment Day and it's like, well, like
Hebrews 12 tells us that.
Right.
12:26 says, at that time his voice shook the earth. But now he has promised, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. So we are not really facing reality if we think that there's not going to be an earthquake.
Yeah.
The earthquake's coming, and everything will be shaken. I think some earthquakes happen in our lifetime. They just shake and they fall to the wayside. But there will be a great shaking on that day when everything will be shaken.
Yeah.
That's
good. Well, someone's at the door, and so we're going to end the podcast here.
Okay. We'll end it with this earth-rattling Hebrews 12:26 passage.
I did want to ask just the last sentence from you. What is the one takeaway you'd want people to have from this passage?
I would say die to yourself and build in Christ.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. On that note, thank you guys for the conversation today.
Mhm.